Friends, with this I start a new series on India's diplomacy. The idea came from a friend, and I think it is the right thing to do. So, how did India's foreign policy begin? It was framed by Jawaharlal Nehru. Before India became independent, Panditji, in a speech in 1946, said that India had not struggled so hard for its independence to become a pawn in the hands of other countries. That was the genesis of non-alignment. The word was not used, but the intent was clear. Now, when we look back on history, we can find flaws. Flaws in the actions of people, in the actions of nations. Things could have been done better. But as the famous historian E.H. Carr said, each age interprets its history to suit its times. And that's really where we are. 75 years after independence, we should now maybe take a fresh look at the early days of India's independence. Did we make a mistake in dealings with the United States, with the Soviet Union, with China? Sure, some flaws can be found. But that's the work of historians. I will leave it aside. So what were the big events that took place in the first, shall we say, 45 years of our life? There was the 1962 border war with China. There was the 1965 war with Pakistan. In 1971, there was the Bangladesh war. And there were a whole series of other events, including non-aligned conference, meetings, and all the rest. But for me, the seminal event that we should focus on as we look back is 1990. Because two major things happened that year. First, the Cold War ended. The division of the world into two major power blocks ended, and there was a kind of unipolar moment, as we now call it. And the second was that Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao launched India's economic reforms. Those economic reforms also had an economic dimension, and I'll come back to that. So, in the first 45 years or so, we focused a great deal on development diplomacy. This was India's unique contribution, of course, along with other countries. At the United Nations, a bloc of developing countries was formed, which was called G77, because at one point there were 77 nations, but of course that bloc now has maybe 120 members, more than 120. So in those days, one of our major focus areas was to mobilize international opinion in favor of the development of the poorer countries of the world, of which India was one. It was successful up to a point, and perhaps not so successful in other ways. That again is a story that needs to be analyzed closely, but I will put it aside because I need to move on. I want to really talk about what happened in 1990. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and his team, which included Dr. Manmohan Singh, it included the External Affairs Minister of those days, the cabinet, the entire diplomatic structure, we kind of reframed ourselves into a situation where the Soviet Union had disappeared and there was now Russia as a successor state with some 14, 15 of its former republics having broken away to become independent countries. That called for astute diplomacy. And at that time, we re-engineered, we re-visualized our relationship with the United States, with West Europe, with Japan, and with other powers in a way that served India's objectives. And that is when we began to discover that in that unipolar world, which slowly morphed into a multipolar world, there was room for India to play a major role. We became one of the players in that situation. So, the task was to focus on the economic development of India, which was really the nub of the economic reforms, but also at the same time craft a foreign policy that served the interests of an India that was going to play a larger role on the stage. Now, there are some people who talk of India becoming a superpower. I think for now that is an illusion. We are nowhere near a superpower. We are really a major power in terms of the size of our country, in terms of the size of our GDP, size of our market, and we are a nation of growing prosperity. That gives us weight. But at the end of the day, the throw weight, the gravitas of a country will really be not its military power, although that is important. Nuclear power is also important, but it is the capacity of the country in the economic arena. Volume of trade, its share of global trade, the attraction to foreign investors, and the role it plays in both receiving technology and delivering technology to other partners. So, in this situation, we have now, in a way, recrafted our foreign policy. We now focus on ourselves and the rest of the world, and we focus especially on neighboring countries. It is to the credit of Narendra Modi, who became Prime Minister in 2014, that for the first time a slogan was coined, Neighbourhood first. Now, to be truthful, there was a period of some 20-25 years when we had rather begun to neglect our neighbours. Exchanges of summit-level visits from the Indian side were relatively few and far between, and these are all documented facts. You can check on the number of prime ministerial visits to Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or to Nepal for that matter during that period. Another set of issues came up, the emergence of China as an increasingly major power. It is now the world's second most important economic power, and also perhaps the second most important military power. And this has also changed the way in which we deal with China. India-China relations is a big subject, and I hope to cover it in another talk. But for now, let me simply say that India's challenge is to adroitly manage its relationship with all the other major powers in a world that is complex, volatile, because changes occur at great speed, new developments occur, like the war in Ukraine. Who could have anticipated, even at the beginning of 2022, that Ukraine would suddenly become a global flashpoint because of Russia's move into Ukraine and its attack on Ukraine? Now, that also has a long history, and I'm not going to get into that, except to say that India's challenge has been to somehow find its way, to navigate its way in the middle of all these issues, these crises, these shoals which can wreck the ship of state, and to find a path that serves India's interests. At the end of the day, each country works for its own self-interest. In an enlightened way, not in a selfish way, not to grab everything it can, but in order to find a way in which it advances its interests in a long-term, calculated way, in a strategic way. I think I will end here because one can go on almost endlessly talking about a subject like this, but it's better that I reserve those comments for future lectures. Thank you very much.